Okay, well, I don't know how do you follow that? I don't know. Okay, well, this is. I mean, especially those of you who've been here from the beginning, and there's a few hardened veterans out there, I can see, will know that I've, by necessity, covered a lot of ground and sort of touched lightly on a lot of stuff and not gone into detail about a great deal. Well, that's even more true tonight. I'm covered a lot of ground, and I'm going to do it quickly, reasonably quickly. I think I can get away with it. Partly because this is stuff most people are somewhat more familiar with than ancient Babylonia or something like that. So we'll get through as much as we can, and then obviously have some time for discussion and so on afterwards. So, okay. The last lecture, I talked a little bit about the growth of the British Empire in the 19th century, consolidated after the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, the basis of the first industrial economy in the world, the global doctrine of free trade. This is a rather wonderful map from 1937. You can see the British colonies splashed red across the globe, and all those little dots are British ships. So it gives you a little sense of the trade routes, the trade connections, an empire of trade. Someone raised the question in the discussion period last week, backed by the global power of the British Royal Navy, hinging on British India, the British Raj in India, the Indian army of Indian soldiers with British officers, the banking and financial centre of the world in London, the global predominance of the pound sterling. I use the term here of hegemony, kind of a useful term. It implies not only economic and military power, not only economic and military predominance, but also leadership. Political leadership, a claim to moral leadership in the world, and the British doctrine of free trade, as we discussed in the last class, was very much part of that. So this is the background to what I want to talk about today: a world dominated by the British Empire. We'd already seen, talking last week, about the processes of national unification in the middle of the 19th century. It's why I started. Caroline was asking him before about the date of 1860. It gives a extra big span of time. But the reason I started that initial slide in 1860 is it marks that period in the middle of the 19th century when you have the process of national unification, the creation of unified nation states in Italy, and in particular in Germany, in Japan, and from a certain point of view in the United States, the first real, in my opinion, genuine unification of the United States. And the consequence of that process in all of those countries was a period of very, very dramatic economic growth, symbolized here by the construction of the first transcontinental railroad in the period immediately after the Civil War, and very rapidly by the last quarter of the 19th century, Britain's industrial predominance. I'm saying industrial predominance is distinct from its military or financial predominance. Britain's industrial predominance is already under tremendous pressure from the growing strength of the United States economy on the one hand, and of German economy on the other. So here's the steel production figures of steel. In 1870, total world production of steel only around 500,000 tons. Still a lot of stuff being manufactured in iron, of course. By 1900, 28 million tons, so huge increase in steel production. and you can see by 1900 how that is distributed. The United States producing 10 million tons of steel annually, Germany 8 million tons, United Kingdom 5 million tons. So by 1900, Britain's predominant industrial position has already been surpassed, first of all by the United States, and secondly by Germany. So this changing economic power, this changing global economic power is sort of going to underpin what I want to talk about in the first part of the lecture tonight. Part of what this does is it drives forward. Well, you can see from the illustration, this is the Krupp gun factory in Essen in the German Ruhr industrial district of Germany, and manufacturing heavy naval artillery. The British, of course, the Americans doing likewise. They start to engage in a naval arms race in the last part of the 19th century and into the early 20th century. They also engage in an intensified competition for colonies, particularly, of course, the Germans arriving late on the scene in Europe. Britain, France, Belgium the Dutch have already acquired plenty of overseas colonies, and the Germans now scrambling to catch up. The consequence of this is the dramatic transformation of the map of Africa, as you can see between 1870 on the left, when essentially European settlement, European colonialism in Africa was, with a couple of exceptions, the British colony in Cape Colony in the south, for example, was pretty much restricted to the coastal regions. There was very little European penetration of the interior of Africa. Just 30 years later, literally the entire African continent, with the exception of Ethiopia and to some degree of Liberia, was under the control of one or another of the major European powers. And of course the Germans, the green on the map on the right here, German East Africa, modern day Tanzania, Cameroon over on the left there, and German Southwest Africa, modern day Namibia. So the Germans establishing their own colonies in Africa as part of this scramble. I talked a little bit in the previous lecture about the increasing pressure on China after the colonial dismemberment of Africa. We see attention turning to China, and there's my favorite fly back on the screen. That is the fly that appears at every single movie at critical points, but it's well trained to always go for the white parts of the screen, if any of you have noticed. Maybe I shouldn't tell you that, because now you'll see it every time. Anyway, so in China, what I want to draw attention to is the British influence, the green, going up the Yangtze Valley, extending British influence. The German on the Shandong Peninsula, the brown. I can't go too close to it, but here, the French colonization of Indochina, and French influence reaching into the southern part of China. And then probably the most dramatic, the expansion of Japan. So Japanese colonial efforts directed into China, the colonization of Korea. Korea becomes a Japanese colony in 1910, and the projection of Japanese influence into Manchuria, northeastern China, as a part of that. 1905, Japan and Russia go to war, essentially over control of Manchuria, and for the first time, an Asian country defeats a European country in a major modern war. Russia is defeated by China. So increasing pressure in China, competition between the various imperial powers in China intensifying, and finally, as I'd indicated in the previous lecture, 1898, the United States itself for the first time becomes a major imperial power, defeats the Spanish in the Spanish-American War, annexes Puerto Rico, gets essentially control over Cuba, and colonizes the Philippines, takes the Philippines from Spain, Guam, etc., and in the same period annexes Hawaii. So the United States itself, after priding itself of being the non-colonial power, in a very short period of time, at the very end of the 19th century, becoming an imperial power in its own right. So we have the British structured world being challenged by these new powers, by the United States, by Germany, by Japan, fundamentally. And I should say the arriving late in the game thing is important. When the United States begins its major drive to industrial development in the last quarter of the 19th century, of course, the British have been an industrial power for the best part of the previous 100 years. A lot of their factories are outdated, a lot of their equipment is outdated, and coming late into the game, coming late into functioning as an industrial power gives certain advantages in terms of being able to employ the most modern plant and equipment, the most productive methods, etc., etc. I just throw that out because that obviously continues to be a factor in the world. In the world today. There's always and inevitably a relationship between economic power on the one hand and political and military power on the other. They don't necessarily develop at precisely the same rate or at precisely the same tempo, but there is an inevitable relationship between them. Clearly the Germans and the United States were not going to be content indefinitely to be a sort of subordinate part of a British-dominated world system. And essentially, and I'm going to summarize about at least 45 years of world history here, one sentence, essentially the first half of the 20th century is sorting that out. Is how that all gets sorted out. We're very used to thinking about it. We don't even necessarily think about it in these terms, but there was nothing predetermined about it. There was nothing predetermined that there wasn't going to be a massive war between Britain and the United States. In 1900, lots of people on both sides thought that was what was going to happen, that the United States was the main global challenger, Britain was the main hegemonic power, there would be some kind of a conflict between them at some point. Well, of course, the sort of hidden truth is there was a very ferocious conflict between them. It just took the form of a conflict that unfolded in the context of a political alliance during World War II. It just unfolded in a rather unusual manner. And by 1945, the United States has emerged as the hegemonic power, predominant hegemonic power. Economic leadership, industrial leadership, it had already acquired by 1900, and then, of course, military power by the end of World War II, political power, and a claim to political and moral leadership of the world, as Britain had exercised in its own time. Well, you'll see there's an important qualification here. Which is that the United States was not actually the hegemonic power in the entire world. It was the hegemonic power in the capitalist world. Because by the time we get to 1945, there's a significant chunk of the world that is no longer capitalist. It doesn't make it socialist. It certainly doesn't make it communist, but it's no longer capitalist. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So that's the arc, if you like, of the first half of the 20th century. It's a sort of shatter zone of a series of wars that finally culminate in the global triumph of the United States. And of course, immediately after this, the United States is going to move to structure that global power. Bretton Woods, I'm sure many of you have been there, in the ski resort now in New Hampshire, the site of the major World Economic Conference that takes place in 1944, June 1944. So even before the war is actually won, the United States already essentially prescribes what the economic structure of the post-war world is going to be. And the main elements of that, as you probably know, the convertibility to gold of the dollar, $35 an ounce. So the dollar can function as the primary international currency. In other words, it replaces the pound sterling as the major currency of world trade. The International Monetary Fund, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the other sort of signal institutions of this of the Bretton Woods Agreement, and the fundamental principle behind it, of course, free trade. So now the United States, as it emerges as the predominant global power, sort of takes over from the British as the champion of free trade. I made the point in a previous lecture that free trade is always the economic doctrine of the stronger imperial powers. By this time, the British are trying to sort of circle the wagons and keep out foreign competition, and so on and so on and so forth. But the United States, essentially, as the British had done in their own time, the United States is going to say, no, we insist, if you want to borrow money from us, if you want loans from us, you have to play by our rules, no trade barriers, global free trade. The United States is going to structure its new position diplomatically, essentially through the United Nations. I know that's not how people like to think about the United Nations, but at least in 1945, the actual power relationships within the United Nations, the structure of the Security Council, basically gave America and its closest allies the political say in the global functioning of the United Nations. And just as the British had been, of course, this is all going to be underpinned by the enormous military power of the United States coming out of World War II. There's no question that American military predominance by 1945 was way in advance of anything the British had, even at the absolute height of British imperial power, British naval power. There were over 3,000 American bases around the world. In every continent. The United States was the only power with nuclear weapons, and of course had used those weapons. A massive global navy capable of power projection in all the major oceans of the world. So again. Financial power, industrial power to start off with, financial power, diplomatic and political power, and of course sort of underpinned by military power, and all framed, and here's the sort of hegemonic issue in the claim to moral leadership, that the Americans were going to act on behalf of liberal principles, democracy, freedom around the world, that the United States had everybody's best interests at heart. I mean, all of those kind of ideas. I was going to get clever and read a little bit from a New York Times article. It's great how these things pop up just when you need them. But anyway, there was you can go back and see, because all kinds of other things cut loose today, and I didn't have time to do this. But anyway, there's a major article in the New York Times today, sort of bewailing the fact that this great world of liberal internationalism is coming apart at the seams. It was perfect. It would have fitted perfectly. So imagine I've read you that. I didn't, but you can go and read it yourselves. It just illustrates the point absolutely brilliantly. So there's the first sort of thing, the expanding arc of American power in the first half of the 20th century. Okay, I want to sort of step back and look at another question and see how it fits into this a little bit. In the last lecture, we talked a little bit about the emergence from 1845 48 onwards of sharper class struggles, political struggles between social classes within the major countries themselves, including, of course, not just struggles against individual oppression or poor working conditions or colonial oppression, but fights that had as their goal the overturn of the capitalist system itself, the beginnings of the international Marxist communist movement, the experience of the Paris Commune in 1871, the first popular government in modern history, certainly, convincing many that big modern wars and big modern revolutions kind of went hand in hand, that the consequences of war, the dislocation of war, would often be a major social upheaval. Well, of course, as history turned out, there was no direct line or no direct relationship between those two things, no straight road. In August 1914, at the beginning of World War I, the Socialist Party members of Parliament, deputies, elected representatives in France, in Britain, in Germany, in all the major European countries, all happily voted, or I don't know happily, but they all voted for the war. They all ended up supporting the First World War, and the people who opposed the war were reduced to a tiny minority. I'm talking about Lenin, some people in the Russian Socialist Party, and handfuls of co-thinkers around Europe. When they met in Zimmerwald in Switzerland in 1915, there were about 40 of them managed to pack into the room. That was it, pretty much, in Europe, of people who had continued to oppose the war. Well, as you all know, that changes. The consequences of World War I, the grinding attrition of World War I, the seemingly endless slaughter produced, first of all in Russia in 1917, and then in Germany and Austria-Hungary in 1918, major popular revolutions. The war, World War I, did not end in military victory. World War I did not end in either side defeating the other in some dramatic military sense. It ended because the Russian Revolution overthrew the Tsarist regime in Russia, and then a year and a month later, November 1918, beginning with a mutiny in the German Navy, a massive popular revolution overthrew the government in Germany and established a new republic and essentially brought the war to an end. The Austro-Hungarian Empire disintegrates into its different national components. The revolutionary wave, if you like, spilled over into France. Huge popular protests in France. In Italy, you have two years of factory occupations, land occupation, peasants seizing land in northern Italy. Even in the United States, there's a huge wave of industrial strikes immediately at the end of World War I, which is totally connected to this process. In many parts of the colonial world, from India to Ireland to the Middle East, there are popular revolts for national independence, an end to colonial rule. In China, you have a big movement of resistance to the carving up of China. And in 1921, you have that sort of coming together for the first time into the formation of a communist party in China. You have new revolutionary movements throughout Southeast Asia. I mean, it's a moment of tremendous revolutionary possibility, it's hard to recapture that in our imaginations. That for a few years, the vision that the Bolsheviks and other socialists had argued of a worldwide revolution that combined working class struggle in the advanced capitalist countries with anti-colonial revolts elsewhere in the world seemed possible. I mean, this burns itself into a generation of people, both on the sort of radical working class side of the equation and on the conservative sort of existing order side of the equation, that a whole generation of diplomats and politicians are deeply concerned that that major wars lead to this kind of. And of course, you have you have in the Soviet Union the overthrow of the capitalist economy. I say, I'm not saying going to stick a label on what it becomes, but private capitalism is eradicated, a planned economy is established. But by the early 1920s, that window closes, and you have the restabilization in Europe of capitalism. A couple of different elements. A lot of this is thanks to US finance. The story that the US becomes isolationist immediately after World War I is simply not true. In a certain political and diplomatic sense, it does become isolationist. It does not participate in the League of Nations. But US finance is actually a brilliant scheme. The US lends money to Germany, so Germany can pay its war reparations payments to Britain and France can then pay their wartime debts to the United States. I mean, it's absolutely huge amounts of money sloshing around, and essentially the consequence of that is as those revolutionary impulse of 1918, 1919, 1920 kind of runs out of energy, you have a restabilization of capitalism in much of Europe. In some countries, I'm thinking here particularly of Italy, that's accompanied by a sort of ultra-nationalist movement. Just getting the economy going was not enough to put an end to these revolutionary impulses, and you have the establishment of the first fascist government in Europe is established in Italy in 1922. And by the way, Mussolini is like enormously popular in the United States and elsewhere. I think he's Time Man of the Year, I forget, 3 or 4 times, and you go back and read articles in the 1920s in the New York Times or major US newspapers, and Mussolini is just the greatest thing ever. He's modernizing Italy, and he's holding back the Bolsheviks, and he's a really great guy. He turns into something else a little bit later, but it's always worth remembering that other side of the story. Okay, in the context of that, the Russian communists had hoped for this world revolution, which would have carried the whole thing forward. In reality, they're left isolated. Economically weak, they're in the middle of a civil war, they just end a civil war, and in that context, what happens in the Soviet Union is the rise of Stalin, sort of I was going to say a national version of communism, but it's really not true. A sort of nationalist sort of antithesis of communism in many ways. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the bloody purges by which the Stalinist regime establishes its power in the Soviet Union during the late 1920s and 1930s. The opponents of Stalin are exiled, there's something like 80,000 people killed in the Soviet Union in this period. I mean, the whole vanguard of the previous communist revolution are basically disposed of. And Stalin's view is very much sort of the defense of the Soviet Union instead of the sort of Leninist view or Trotsky's view of the expansion of world revolution. Stalin's view is very much circle the wagons in the Soviet Union. Okay, this precarious stability of the 1920s is of course shattered by the Great Depression. Begins with the Wall Street crash in 19 1929, it inevitably, as ruptures in the financial sector inevitably do, it ripples out into the so-called real economy, massive unemployment, huge factory closures. You're familiar with the general character of the depression. In every single country, every single major country, the response is an autarkic response. That's to say, a national-centric response. A withdrawal from world trade. World trade collapses between 1929 and 1931 to something like 10 or 15% of its previous level. I mean, it's a dramatic collapse in world trade. And every single country, from the New Deal in the United States to the rise of I'm not saying they're the same thing, but there are some similarities to the rise of Nazism in Germany, prioritized national recovery over international trade, and of course that's most sharply evident in Germany with the triumph of the ultra-nationalist Nazi Party in 1933. By the way, I don't know how, there's been a lot of, I think, nonsense written about modern contemporary politics and analogies to Nazi. This is what it looks like. This is what it looks like. This is tens of thousands of disciplined stormtroopers that was necessary to smash the German working class movement to make possible the rise of fascism. And I'm not saying we're not going to see it, but all I'm saying is we ain't seen it yet. Trust me, you'll know it when you see it. So, the renewed nationalist pressures of the 1930s culminate in a series of wars. Maybe we'll do a lecture series on this at some point in the future. I don't know. We think about it as World War II as a sort of discrete entity that begins in 1939 and ends in 1945. It really begins in 1931 with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. It probably goes through to 1953 with the Korean War. But it's a whole period of wars, different participants that are sort of overlapping and building on each other, and finally, by the entry of the United States, or the formal entry, I should say, of the United States into that war in December 1941, becomes a world war, becomes a genuinely global war, and that's the road to the establishment of American hegemony that I was talking about previously. But that war is won by a really surprising alliance. That war is won fundamentally by an alliance between the Soviet Union, which does most of the fighting and dying, and the United States that does most of the producing. I'm not making any moral judgments on that. Just to say that out of every 10 German soldiers who are killed during World War II, 9 of them are killed by Russians. I mean, it's an amazing legacy, history of the resistance of the Soviet Union and the scale of it. But equally amazing in a certain sense is the gigantic wartime expansion of the United States economy, and it's one of the most unprecedented periods of economic growth in world history. It virtually doubles the American gross domestic product over a period of 4 or 5 years. The United States, I mean, it's hard to, you all are familiar with, many of you are familiar with this, but you know, when you lecture to an audience of as college-age students, the idea of the United States as the major producer in the entire world, the producer of automobiles and refrigerators and radios and every type of consumer goods imaginable, and their export worldwide is just beyond people's to think, I raise that just to think about that process of the enormous expansion of the productive capacity of the American economy. So the two things that happen here. One is that the United States does establish its hegemony within the capitalist part of the world. But the non-capitalist part of the world not only survives the war, which no one thought it would in June 1941 when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union. No one thought it would, bar a few handfuls of people. But it not only survives, it comes out strengthened. So right from the beginning of the establishment of American hegemony, it is qualified by the fact that there's a big chunk of the world where American economic power does not reach. You can't invest there, you can't sell stuff there, you can't get your debts paid if they owe you money, it's not a capitalist economy. As I say, whatever else it is, So the result of that is that coming out of World War II, we go directly and immediately into the Cold War. I mean, the two phenomena, the great expansion of the American post-war economy, which some of us lived through at least part of it, I would say it's formed most of our lives. It's shaped most of our lives and most of our outlook. Is that experience of economic growth, which is a very unusual historical period, as you're probably aware by now, having sat here for the last six weeks and talked about a lot of different kinds of... This is a very unusual period of the growth and expansion of the United States economy. But it was always tied up. It was always intertwined with the deepening of the so-called Cold War against the Soviet Union. It was only cold because they couldn't quite get the advantage to launch a hot war. Because for its own reasons, the Soviet Union was more interested in trying to maintain the wartime alliance. And, of course, by 1949, the Soviet Union develops its own atomic weapons. We have a world structured by a nuclear, or military affairs structured by nuclear standoff for the next 35 years or so. My point here is, even from the beginning, the actuality of the American century, the actuality of American hegemony is qualified. And it gets more qualified really quickly. In 1949, in some ways, the great prize of the Pacific War to China. I mean, we've talked about China and the importance of access to the Chinese market and all of that stuff previously. China slips from America, the grasp of the United States. The Chinese Revolution is victorious, despite Stalin trying to partition. I mean, it's an amazing story. And the most populous country in the world joins the other side of the equation, the non-capitalist world side of the equation. And of course, that's going to continue into Korea in the early 1950s. The United States' military in Korea, it's not a defeat for the United States, but it's not a victory. It's the first war that the United States fights that it does not win. And the war, of course, ends in the military partition of the Korean Peninsula. The consequences of that partition and of the underlying desire of the Korean people for unity continues to be a major factor in global politics to this day. And then, of course, the bottom right-hand illustration by the middle of the 1950s, well, right after the war, the United States changes its mind. Roosevelt changes his mind. Up until then, they didn't want to reintroduce the French colonial power to French Indochina to Vietnam. By 1945, they've changed their mind in the context of the deepening tension with the Soviet Union. The United States, well, actually, they get Britain to do the dirty work and bring the French back into Indochina, but it's always going to be underwritten by the United States. By 1954, the French are basically beaten by the Vietnamese at Dien Bien Phu, and increasingly after that, as you all know, the United States is going to be drawn directly into the war in Vietnam. Immediately after the war, there's a tremendous upsurge of anti-colonial struggles. India becomes independent in 1947. Indonesia, a little bit British try and impose colonial rule, reimpose colonial rule in Burma and Malaya, but it's always problematic. And then from the 1950s, you start to see the development of anti-colonial movements in Africa. British Gold Coast becomes independent as Ghana in 1957, Nigeria in 1960, and then there's a great tidal wave of the French colonies, French West Africa, becoming independent. So you have a transformation of the map. Not that this is all necessarily directly negative to American interest, but it certainly all makes for a more unstable world, more difficult to manage. And then the Cuban Revolution in 1959, the first real popular revolution that takes place outside of the framework of Stalinism, and of course inspires all kinds of other rebellions in Latin America in particular, but has truly global consequences. I think there's absolutely no doubt that without the Cuban Revolution, without the Cuban military aid to the Angolans, that Mandela would have died in prison. There's absolutely no doubt about that. That it's the Cuban military aid to Angola that finally turns the tide against apartheid in South Africa. By 1975, the victory in the victory of the Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, the overthrow of the pro-American regime in Saigon. Again, now we're into not just wars that don't go that well. Now we're into wars that the United States actually loses, again, the consequences of that. And then 1979, the Iranian Revolution. Of course, slandered as, I shouldn't say slandered, misdescribed as an Islamic, as a sort of religious phenomenon. It is not fundamentally a religious phenomenon. It's fundamentally a popular revolt against the Shah and his relationship with the United States. But as many of you will probably experience, this is accompanied by the revolution in Nicaragua, etc. at the same time. That attempt to create this American century, to exercise that global hegemony is always challenged on a pretty substantial scale, and in a deepening way. The United States' response, of course, is to under Reagan in the 1980s is to expand the American military, in particular to re-up the American nuclear capacity. One of the factors, not the main factor, but one of the factors putting increasing pressure on the Soviet Union. And by the end of the 80s, there is a tremendous wave of popular rebellions, upsurges, revolutions, whatever you want to call them, in country after country of the Eastern Bloc, of the so-called communist bloc, and the overthrow of these Stalinist regimes, and the collapse and end of the Soviet Union itself. Well, many of us are old enough to remember the great triumphalism of the sort of mainstream media, that this was a huge victory. This was a completely unqualified victory for the United States. That a guy called Francis Fukuyama, some of you might remember him, wrote a book called The End of History. The idea that anyone could even argue that now seems utterly bizarre. But I mean, this was a really popular book, right? He argued that the conclusion of all history was liberal democracy, and we'd finally got there. I mean, other stuff was going to happen and so on, but you know, it was basically done. It was basically done. Well, I think whatever we are, 20 whatever years later, that looks. Not only does Fukuyama's idea that history had come to an end look completely absurd, but the idea that the United States won the Cold War looks a little shaky as well. That the United States did not win the war. It doesn't mean the Soviets won it, clearly. But what happened in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union was not fundamentally a triumph of the United States. It was a triumph of popular democratic movements within those countries, and it's an important qualification, because of course the idea was, we win the Cold War, we're going to get we United States are going to get these massive new markets, we could expand, we can start exporting to the former Soviet Union, everything's going to be wonderful, and of course none of that's really happened. None of that's happened. In fact, as you're all aware, the tensions between Russia and the United States are deepening. Rather than consolidating the US hegemony, the overthrow of the Stalinist regimes, particularly in the Ukraine and elsewhere, had won more space for working people to organize, and in a certain sense more instability in the world in the world system. This coincides by the late 80s with increasing evidence that long period of tremendous economic expansion coming out of World War II had come to an end. The United States abandons the Bretton Woods Agreement. The dollar is taken off, the dollar is no longer. Try converting your dollars to gold today, good luck. The dollar floats against gold. All of those structures, the financial structures that have been put in place in 1944 and 1945 are gradually unraveled. The productivity of American industry vis-a-vis its competitors, particularly in China and Japan, in the European Union, elsewhere, declines. As is often the case in such situations, more and more money gets funneled into speculative binges. There's a whole series of them that you've probably forgotten most of them, but one after another, all of them blown up, and all of them come crashing down. The unemployment figures are increasingly massaged to remove most people who are actually unemployed from the figures. The real figure in the United States, I don't know, I don't want to speculate, but it's at depression levels of either unemployed or partially employed, years after years after years, without raises, cutbacks in health. I mean, we're all familiar with this stuff, but you got to put it together in this picture of the effect of depression-like conditions. Depression-like conditions, like existed in the 1930s, but in the context where there were new challenges to American power. I mentioned Russia, India, Brazil, but of course fundamentally China. Fundamentally China. It turns out that what you don't deal with comes back and bites you in the ass. The incapacity of the United States to actually control China during and after World War II, which is a whole other question, which you can ask me about in the question, but I'm not going to get into it. But the fact that China is always, for this period, outside of the American economic orbit, finally by the 1970s, as China makes its own structural adjustment, I don't know. I put a question mark there because I don't even know if it's a scientifically accurate description, but it's the best one that I have, which is you have big chunks of private capitalism in China, but you also have a state that for its own reasons is willing to mobilize enormous, I probably said this here before, I certainly, you think about what it means to live on the main line between New York and Montreal, right? The investment in infrastructure, of the most modern type that facilitate, not just in China itself. I was given another article the last lecture from The Economist about the so-called one road, one belt policy. The Economist, British Economist magazine characterized it as the Chinese Marshall Plan. Huge Chinese investment in Pakistan, in big chunks of Africa. I mean, this is a huge thing that's happening in the world, and of course, it inevitably, just like it did in this is the shatter zone. I mean, I made the point about the first part of the 20th century, the transition from British to American hegemony. We're entering into an analogous period of global history, is my point. In which economic power, you can read a lot of different things, different economists will tell you different things, but there's no question that Chinese gross domestic product is going to pass US gross domestic product in the next 10 or 15 years. If you go on purchasing power parity, PPP, which some economists prefer to as a way of calculating gross domestic product, Chinese economy is already past the United States economy. That can't happen without it being translated into other forms of power. It can't happen without it being translated into military power. And anyone who studies this stuff, the phenomenal rise in the military capacity of China, in particular, as I'm sure have all seen some stuff about this, the growing tensions in the South China Sea, in particular. I mean, the first American aircraft carrier to visit Vietnam, right? Just happened two weeks ago or something. United States trying to put together a regional alliance to try and contain this. But whether that's going to prove, well, I'm not making a prediction here. I'm not making a prediction about how what this is all going to look like. I made the point before, in 1900, many people would have said the next war is going to be between the United States and Britain. They're the two major contestants. They're the old and the new. And that obviously would have turned out to be not entirely accurate. So I'm a little wary about. What I will say is World War II, as I described it, was not, World War II did not begin with two teams forming up and going at it, right? It began with a whole series of regional wars that overlap and build on each other in different ways. That's much more likely what in my opinion, what you're going to see. But this is happening in a world in which nuclear weapons are held by all the major players in this conflict. It's happening in a world in which anthropogenic climate change is accelerating at an enormous rate, in which all kinds of other crises are accumulating. So, when people have been talking this week about they want to come and hear about the end of the world, and you thought I was joking, but I sort of was joking. I mean, there's no question that at one level the prognosis is pretty bleak. There's no question that the United States power is declining and is going to decline, economic power. There's no question that the United States is increasingly going to try and use its enormous military power to shore that up. I mean, ask anyone, if you know anyone serving in the military, you'll know what that means in terms of deployment after deployment, and the attempt to use American military power, these regional conflicts. We could talk about the Middle East, we could talk about South Asia, but you've also got to think back, it seems to me, to that other side of the equation that we talked about from the Paris Commune onwards, which none of this necessarily happens without at least the possibility of alternatives being fought for, whether or not they're won in the final analysis. Contrary to most liberal pundits, there's far more workers in the world there's far more industrial workers in the world today than at any other time in history. It's just that most of them live in China. I mean, you can see that as most of our allies live in China, or our potential allies live in China. I mean, that's another way of thinking about that. That none of these major questions have been resolved. I mean, wasn't that an enormous? I mean, to me, the sight of the Korean hockey team marching into the stadium in the middle of all this with a banner with the uniform. The banner had one thing on it. It was a little map of Korea as a unified place. With no line on it, with no division on it. That's not gone away, despite all of this other stuff that we've been talking about. So I'm going to leave you with one thought, and I make no apology for this. It's coming from Marx, but it's probably like the most famous sentence that Marx. This is from the beginning of the It's the very beginning part of the Communist Manifesto, where Marx is describing how all history's. You know, and if you've been listening to me carefully over the past 6 weeks, you know I get a lot of stuff from here. No apology. And it talks about how these conflicts shape history and they'll go. But the end bit's what I want to draw your attention to, right? That these struggles, these contests, these fights, Marx says, he says each time they end either in a revolutionary reconstruction of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. It's not, Marx never said this is inevitable. It's not the point. That there's a battle that has an unforeseen outcome at the present time. That it's possible. It's possible. Just as it was possible in the 1920s and these were moments when things were possible was not really possible for most of our lifetimes. See, it's comfortable. It's not comfortable living in the shatter zones. It's comfortable living if you live in the right place in the world. It's comfortable living in the period of hegemony and prosperity and being the world's #1 producer of automobile. It's comfortable. It's not comfortable necessarily for everyone in the rest of the world, but that's what's changing. And the challenge is to sort of break down the barriers that see ourselves as something apart from the rest of the world and see that the alternative, there is an alternative. That humanity does have the possibility of advancing, although the dangers of the common ruin. I mean, when Marx wrote this, he's thinking about the end of the Roman Empire and the dark ages that follow. If the dark ages follow now, they're going to be very dark, very dark. But they're not inevitable. And on that happy thought, my friends, we'll take a few questions.